Hello again, it's Daniel Rosney here, a journalist in the UK who has long had a fascination with monarchies from around the world. Ever since I can remember, I've wanted to know more about kings, queens, privilege and palaces, and that is what this podcast is, as I try to uncover a little bit more about those people who reign over more than 40 countries. Some have very little power, while others rule with an iron fist. The one thing that they all have in common, from Monaco to Morocco, from Thailand to Tonga, and from Jordan to Japan, every monarch on the planet right now is a man. That won't be the case forever. Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Spain all have females as their heirs, but it could be decades before they inherit their thrones, which is something the person we're going to look at in this edition of It's Raining Men knows all too well, because he became king at the age of 73 in 2022, Charles III. And in this episode, we're going to focus entirely on his role as King of Canada.
I, Mark Carney, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty, King Charles III, King of Canada, his heirs and successors.
The voice of Mark Carney, who in the past week became the Prime Minister of Canada, a country where King Charles III is monarch. The British King reigns over the United Kingdom, as well as 14 other nations known as the Realms: Antigua and Barbuda, Australia, the Bahamas, Belize, Grenada, Jamaica, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and of course, Canada. In those nations, he's represented by a Governor-General, an official who carries out duties in the King's name. Ever since the 1500s, a succession of French and then British monarchs have reigned over Canada, even though the head of state lives thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. The Canadian government says His Majesty's role is to unite Canadians and give a collective sense of belonging to our country. But in recent weeks, that description of uniting Canadians has been discussed and debated by many because of how King Charles III has responded to the US President Donald Trump. If you've been keeping up with the news, it's hard to miss this that's been coming from the White House.
Canada would be great as our cherished 51st state. You wouldn't have to worry about borders. You wouldn't have to worry about anything.
We're hearing it more and more, and within hours of becoming Prime Minister, Mark Carney responded to Donald Trump.
We will never, ever, in any way, shape, or form, be part of the United States. America is not Canada.
Politicians are making their voices heard, but crucially, the King hasn't spoken about Canada's sovereignty. There have been subtle gestures. He wore his Canadian medals recently, for example, but there's been no firm statement from Buckingham Palace around Donald Trump's wish. There has, though, been an invitation from the palace to the White House for a historic second state visit for President Trump to come to the United Kingdom, something that the British Prime Minister wanted to happen. So where does this leave Charles III as King of Canada, if he's going to be whining and dining a president who wants to take over a country that the King is head of state of, which so happens to be the second largest country in the world? The short answer is it's a complicated exercise in diplomacy. But can the King actually do anything? What is his responsibility and his duty as King of Canada, other than, as the government describes it, uniting people? Carolyn Harris is a historian in Toronto, and she can help us understand what the monarch's role is. Hello, Carolyn. Before we begin and we get into this discussion, could you just explain to us the history of Canada and its connection with the royal family?
Where we see that connection with royal history in 1534, when Jacques Cartier is claiming territory in the name of the King of France. And then eventually Louis XIV would make New France, which is now part of the province of Quebec, into a crown colony. And we see New France being managed by the French crown. Louis XIV was quite ambitious about this. He sent over boatloads of female colonists to try to expand the French population there, which was quite small compared to the number of British colonists landing in the 13 colonies that would become part of the United States. But Louis XIV's great-grandson and successor, Louis XV, he complained about the cost of New France. So when the 7 Years' War takes place, we have the fall of Quebec in 1759 to the British. In 1763, the French had a choice of did they want to hold on to the Sugar Islands, Guadeloupe, Martinique, Haiti, or did they want to hold on to Canada? They opted to hold on to the Sugar Islands. And so Canada passes to the British in 1763. And of course, Britain is a constitutional monarchy at that time. There had been these royal structures in place, and now it was a British constitutional monarchy stepping in to that place. And Canada achieves Confederation in 1867, control over its own domestic policy, and Queen Victoria is quite active in this process that she advocated for Confederation. She received the Fathers of Confederation. So political figures across various Canadian provinces who had very little in common with one another, who might have different economic interests, were united by this shared loyalty to the Queen. So it's interesting that Victoria Day is still celebrated as a holiday in Canada. It's not a holiday in the United Kingdom, but in Canada...
Queen Victoria's birthday is still a holiday.
Yeah, Queen Victoria's birthday. It's still a holiday, and it's the sovereign's official birthday in Canada. As sort of mother of the British Empire, Queen Victoria did exert some diplomatic influence. So we see an influence on Canadian history. And then we see this gradual, more and more autonomy for Canada. Canada had long wanted some more control over its foreign policy, particularly in relation to the United States, as sometimes British and Canadian interests regarding relations with the United States didn't always line up, and that's something that's coming up today as well. So in 1926, it's agreed the self-governing dominions are equal in status to the United Kingdom. And then 1931, we have the Statute of Westminster, and so the Dominions get control over their own foreign policy, and it means the crown becomes divisible. King George VI, when he visits Canada in 1939, it's as King of Canada.
So the links between the crown and Canada had existed for more than 200 years, but the first monarch to visit wasn't until 1939.
The modern royal tour really dates from 1860, though, when Queen Victoria's eldest son, the future Edward VII, went on tour. He opens the Victoria Bridge in Montreal. He visits Niagara Falls. A lot of the aspects of royal tours that we think of receiving lots of public delegations, receptions, visiting the major tourist sites. Then we have that very politically significant royal tour in 1939, where George VI is there as the first reigning sovereign to tour Canada, rather than an heir to the throne or an extended member of the royal family on military or diplomatic service.
And while Queen Elizabeth II visited numerous times,
yes,
we're now 2.5 years into the reign of King Charles III, and he's still not visited Canada as monarch.
Yes, Queen Elizabeth II was there for all these key moments in Canadian history. And it's interesting, her last visit to Canada in 2010 at an official dinner at the Royal York Hotel here in Toronto, where royalty traditionally stay. The then Prime Minister Stephen Harper gave a hockey-laden speech about how the Queen was our most valuable player over the course of all of these decades. King Charles III, as Prince of Wales, visited Canada on numerous occasions. Since 1970, he accompanied his parents and sister Princess Anne in 1970 on a very historic tour of the Arctic, visiting Tuktoyaktuk and Iqaluit at a time when the United States was questioning Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic during the Cold War. Once again, there's some parallels, and this was a time when having a high-profile royal visit to the Arctic was a subtle way of showing that Canada was very much sovereign in the region. But they haven't visited since King Charles III's accession to the throne. There are many reasons for that. The primary one is that King Charles III is still being treated for cancer, and so his health has precluded the kind of busy schedule that he would normally have.
As he hasn't visited, has that affected Canada's relationship with the Crown in any way?
I think in terms of interest in the royal family, it's had an effect. We need to separate the Crown. The constitutional monarchy as a system of government keeps functioning, whether the monarch is in Canada or not. It's not exactly hostility towards the monarchy, but a sort of growing indifference that there are many people who don't necessarily think about the royal family very much in a Canadian context.
We're talking in a week where Canada has a new Prime Minister. Now, in the UK, the monarch asks the Prime Minister to form a government in their name, but obviously the monarch of Canada is in the United Kingdom. So
Yes.
how does that happen?
Well, this is where the Governor General representing the monarch can ask the incoming Prime Minister to form a government. So it's a similar Westminster system, but the role of the monarch is devolved to the Governor General as the monarch's representative. But in terms of giving royal assent to legislation, forming a government, the Governor General has all of these powers. Sometimes on royal visits, we will see the sovereign undertaking their duties as head of state. Queen Elizabeth II opened Parliament.
And the current Governor General is a woman. She's called Mary Simon. Carolyn, how is she chosen? Does the monarch decide, or is it the Prime Minister suggesting who the person should be, or can you apply for the job?
No, the monarch chooses, but it's on the recommendation of the Prime Minister.
And even though there is a new Prime Minister, the Governor General stays in position, though, right?
Yes, the Governor General stays in that position.
Okay, so let's now explore this conversation that's been happening around the King's role as King of Canada, especially as Donald Trump has said that the country should be the 51st state of the United States of America, and the King hasn't directly responded to that, and he has instead invited Mr. Trump on a state visit to the United Kingdom, but that's in his role as King of the United Kingdom. But there aren't two kings here. There's only one king of two countries.
Well, this is a difference in policy between the two prime ministers, in that the Prime Minister, Kier Starmer, in the United Kingdom is very focused on having harmonious trade relations with the United States at a time when President Donald Trump is going around imposing tariffs on allies and otherwise acting very unpredictably when it comes to global trade and alliances. So for Prime Minister Kier Starmer, the focus is on the United Kingdom's trade relationship with the United States. So he will have advised King Charles III to issue an invitation for a state visit, as President Trump greatly admires the royal family. He enjoys the pomp and circumstance of royal occasions. And this is an opportunity for diplomatic work to take place between the United States and the United Kingdom. In Canada, the concern is regarding Canada's sovereignty as these tariffs are being imposed, and President Trump has mused about making Canada the 51st state. That has not been well received in Canada. So Canadian priorities are very different. There have been calls in Canada for the king to make some kind of overt show of support, but he's in a very delicate situation in that he is being advised by multiple prime ministers, but it's been noted that really this isn't so much a difference between Canada and the king as between the Canadian government and the British government, that the two prime ministers need to discuss this, that the crown shouldn't be brought in to the political arena.
But I'm curious if it has now become a discussion in the political arena around what exactly the king's role is in Canada.
Well, certainly it's created discussion of, if there's a royal tour going forward, what will that tour look like, as that would be very much a way for King Charles III to be before the world's media as King of Canada. And then, of course, it remains to be seen how a tour would unfold. the Canadian government would be advising on the itinerary, and depending on who is prime minister, that they might be interested in having the king undertake constitutional duties like open parliament, and that would be sending a very clear signal, or simply have the king be present in a Canadian context, engaging with Canadian military regiments and charities.
I wonder if the monarch of Canada has ever undertaken a state visit as king or queen of Canada, or hosted a state visit as king or queen of Canada rather than as king or queen of the United Kingdom.
So President Donald Trump, when he visits the United Kingdom, he will be received by King Charles III in that capacity as king of the United Kingdom, receiving the American president. In instances where the monarch has traveled to the United States after visiting Canada, this is where we see the monarch in that capacity as king or queen of Canada. So 1939 is the most famous example that King George VI and Queen Elizabeth traveled to the World's Fair and to Hyde Park on Hudson and to Washington in that capacity as King and Queen of Canada in 1939. And they were accompanied by Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. And Mackenzie King had fought for this. He wanted to make clear that if the monarch was traveling from Canada to the United States, that it was as monarch of Canada rather than as monarch of the United Kingdom. And in Britain, that suited British interests at that time because there was isolationist sentiment in the United States in 1939. The king traveling with a British delegation might have been sending a message that the United States was going to be entering the war once the war broke out. But traveling with a Canadian delegation, it was a way of making the royal visit more palatable.
This is where we get into a bit of speculation here, because there is some press murmurings and some reporting that the king may visit the United States next year in 2026 to mark 250 years of its independence, with, it's reported, President Trump likely to return the invitation of a state visit to King Charles and Queen Camilla.
It remains to be seen what will happen, whether King Charles III would travel from Canada to the United States with a Canadian escort and with Canadian politicians, and how that might be received. Once again, King Charles III's in a very delicate situation that if he does travel to the United States in the future, that there will be a British interest that he will be advised on. There will be Canadian interests. And at the present time, it's a very complicated situation to be in, to be the head of state of 15 different independent countries who all have their own foreign policy priorities, particularly regarding the relationship with an increasingly volatile United States.
Carolyn, thank you so much for speaking with me on this podcast, It's Raining Men.
Thank you.
It's been a genuine pleasure learning about the history of the monarchy in Canada.
Thank you. Lovely to talk with you.
Coming up, we're going to look at what exactly the support is for the monarchy in Canada, as well as how difficult it might be for Republicans to get rid of the king as head of state. That's after this short break. On a previous episode of It's Raining Men, we looked at King Carl XVI Gustaf of Sweden, and we heard from a research institution which had gathered data from 26,000 people on what they thought about Swedish society. One of the subjects was the monarchy and individual members of the royal family. That episode is in the podcast feed if you want to queue it up after this. But when it comes to Canada, there is no real equivalent to match data of that size. Instead, we can only look at small samples of 2,000 or so Canadians, which can only ever suggest a trend, especially in a country that has around 40 million people living in it. It's something, though, that Republican groups who want to get rid of the monarchy in Canada are trying to highlight. They use opinion polls, and I'll give you a flavour here of some of them since Charles has been King of Canada. And again, a reminder, it is a small sample size. A March 2024 survey suggests only 23% of Canadians support a monarchy, 46% would rather have an elected head of state. An April 2023 polling took place just before the King's coronation, and 52% of respondents to that one said that they didn't want a constitutional monarchy to continue for generations to come. Now, there are examples of countries that have removed the British monarch as a head of state. The most recent was Barbados, who did it in 2021. But for Canada, it could be much more complicated because of the Constitution. That's what Philip Lagasse, who's an associate professor at the University of Carleton and somebody who researches the Crown and the Constitution, believes. Philip, thank you for coming on It's Raining Men. I read an article that you wrote back in 2023 where you put forward the case and the argument that republicanism in Canada could be, and I quote from this article, you say it could be a hopeless cause. Why is that?
So I think it's important to recognize that Canada went through a fairly significant constitutional revolution, in a way, in 1982. The Canadian government, alongside the provinces with their agreement, requested and consented that the British Parliament pass the Canada Act 1982. And included in the Canada Act 1982 was a termination of legislative sovereignty of the United Kingdom over Canada, and two critical elements. First, a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is fairly well known. And second, a constitutional amending formula. And that amending formula imposed some very rigid rules around the offices of the Queen, the Governor-General, and the Lieutenant Governors in the provinces. Specifically, it requires that changes to those offices, and therefore to the status of the Crown in Canada, effectively, requires the unanimous agreement of all provincial legislatures and the federal parliament. So it is the highest bar that one has in terms of constitutional amendment in Canada. So as you might imagine, this is fairly significant.
There appears to be a growing indifference to the monarchy in Canada, and the polling suggests there's a rise in Republicans in the country, but their overall aim to remove the British monarch as head of state isn't necessarily something that could be achieved.
Most people could take it or leave it, to be honest. By the same token, there's not a strong monarchist sentiment in Canada by any means. It's a very small minority. But for the most part, most people either don't see its relevance, think it would be too much trouble to deal with, and are largely indifferent. It doesn't cost us much of anything aside from royal tours. And so the movement, unlike in the Caribbean or in Australia, has never had much momentum behind it. And the minute that you start thinking about, well, how would you replace this system? You run into innumerable difficulties. All the difficulties that go along with trying to replace your concept of the state, trying to identify, well, what are the things you might want to do with the Crown? Do you want it to be an elected president? How would that work in the provinces? What would the relationship be in the federation? And then what would happen to the Crown's treaty relationships with Indigenous peoples? And this is before you even get to the amending formula. It's funny to say, but if you are a fervent Republican in Canada, the best way to get rid of the monarchy in Canada is to lobby for republicanism in the United Kingdom, because that would be much faster. With your single parliament, you could do it with one act, and it would force us in a way to deal with the question.
I hadn't thought of that point of view. So by removing the monarch in the United Kingdom, that would also make it easier to remove the monarch in other nations as well.
In Canada in particular, the reason that it's even more devastating for Canadian constitutional change is when the heads of government of the realms decided to change the succession law in 2013.
And that change was, regardless of gender, the eldest child becomes the heir in all of the countries where the monarch is head of state.
Precisely. So providing gender equality and liberalizing some of the rules. But in order to bring about that change, Australia, New Zealand, they passed their own laws of succession, recognizing that they have their own law of succession, of royal succession. Canada, in order to avoid this same amending formula, said, we don't have a law of succession. We have a principle of symmetry, whereby whoever is monarch in the United Kingdom is recognized as monarch in Canada. But this then raises a very interesting question. What happens if there is no monarch in the United Kingdom? The Canadian government perspective on this is very much, well, we shouldn't worry about this. This will never happen. But it is curious, in the world that we're living in today, can we say with certainty that the United Kingdom will never end the monarchy? I don't know. But it does leave Canada with this interesting vulnerability in its constitutional framework, because we would then have to deal with the question that we've avoided for so long.
So with these statements coming from Donald Trump and the White House over Canada's sovereignty, has that brought with it any questions then in terms of identity for Canadians, especially around the role of the monarch, who is king of multiple countries?
I think the position that the king has found himself in, effectively torn between two governments and two roles as head of state, has disappointed some Canadians because they don't quite understand why the king hasn't come out and said something directly. And so if you don't have a good understanding of constitutional monarchy, and the whole idea being that the monarch simply doesn't act absent advice from their prime minister, it would not be correct constitutionally for King Charles to say anything, no matter how he feels about Canada, without the explicit advice of his Canadian prime minister. And so what we've relied on is subtle signals, the king wearing his Canadian medals. But within Canada, because of this misunderstanding of how constitutional monarchy works, there was an expectation that he's our head of state, he should say something. And those who were already in favor of a republic seized upon this and said, well, this is further evidence that this institution simply has to go. It's not fit for purpose anymore. It doesn't. If we have to share our head of state, and our head of state is not able to defend us and speak out for us, then this really doesn't work.
So in this scenario, and genuinely pun not intended, does the British government trump the Canadian government when it comes to the king?
We don't want to say that, but the reality is the reality. It is the British royal family. As the Canadian government has argued, our rule of royal succession is that we simply recognize the British monarch as our head of state, as our king or queen, and just look at the operation of it.
And I'm fascinated to know, because even though Canada has just got a new prime minister, there still needs to be a general election this year. So will the monarchy become a subject in any of the political parties' manifestos?
It might, but when you go down the list of priorities, the monarchy, or getting rid of the monarchy, despite whatever people may have felt about the king's absence, is still going to be very much at the bottom of that list.
That appeared to be the feeling in Australia last year when people were asked about the monarchy's relationship with its citizens as Charles was visiting there, and people were saying it is just so far down the list of priorities, especially because they've recently had a referendum on a completely separate constitutional issue which divided the nation, and they just don't want to debate something so contentious again. But Australia in 1999 had a referendum to retain the monarchy. But I'm right in saying I think that Canada has never had a referendum on retaining the British monarchy.
No, I mean, it would not have been packaged that way. We've never had a referendum on the monarchy, but the monarchy was actually an interesting part of our constitutional revolution in 1982, namely the desire to protect it and make sure that it would not be easily removed.
Right, okay, so to conclude, your advice to Republicans in Canada is to go to the UK and help the Republican movement there and lobby to remove the king as monarch, as head of state.
Yes, if you suddenly are flush with money and you are a firm Republican and you want to change the Canadian Constitution, in terms of value for money, your bang for your buck, you should be investing in Republic Now or whatever it's called in the United Kingdom. You'll have a much more successful endeavor because it might actually happen in the UK, whereas in Canada, it's given our amending formula next to impossible. I would even go so far as to say we're more likely to become the 51st state than we are to become a republic.
Wow, okay. Philip, thank you so much for coming on It's Raining Men and talking us through that.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to It's Raining Men. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends who also might be interested in kings, queens, power, and palaces. And it would be great if you could subscribe so more episodes appear in your feed as soon as they're ready. And if you want to suggest a topic to be explored or have any questions about monarchies or specific members of royal families, you can find us on social media. Just search It's Raining Men. There's also a weekly newsletter on Substack too. Speak soon.